I was told earlier that I had to come down here because you were much like church. Everyone was sitting in the back of the room and not in the front. And I just told a story that, as most of you know, I'm originally from Fort Wayne. And our home church, right down the street, is remodeling their chapel. And about 3 weeks ago, they were giving away the pews in the chapel, and drove up and got a pew to take home to put in our basement. And when I got there, I said, is this pew from the front of the church or the back? Because I want one from the front because it wasn't used too often. So good to see you all. I got a few, I've seen a lot of familiar faces, but there are some new faces here today. How many in the group today have been in county government less than 5 years? Raise your hands. Okay. 5 years ago, next month, was when I left the state auditor's office. So it's hard to believe it's been that long. How many between 5 and 10 years? How many between 10 and 15? And I know there are a few of you, how many closer to me with 24 years? Well, for many of you, some of what we're going to talk about will be a drive down memory lane. And for some of you, it will be totally new. But I thought it was going to be important today as we talk about max levy and we talk about the property tax structure and we talk about your 1782 notices that Jackie asked us to do, that we kind of talk about a little bit of historical perspective on actually, how did we get where we are? One of the things we want to do is, because there have been changes in how the max levy is calculated, some of those that have taken effect the last couple of years, a few of those things that have taken effect or will take effect this year, and there will be some that will take effect next year as well. We're not going to deal with those yet because we're just focused on what's happening this year. We want you to be able to learn it, build it yourself, and then own it. Our course objectives, as Jackie gave us, understanding the current property tax processes, the history, understand the history of growth quotient, what that really means, your 1782 notices, and we really want this to be an interactive session. If your questions and your interests are not related to anything we're talking about, raise your hands and just ask what you want to hear and what you want to know. And if we know it, we'll answer, and if we need to do some more research, we'll get back to you in the next couple of days. But we really want to make sure that this is of value to you, and that's why you continue to come early to the Auditors Conference, to this early session. Doc Bowen. Where's Marshall County? There you are. The pride of Marshall County, the father of property tax reform. Doc Bowen was elected governor in 1972, came from the Indiana House. He had a long history in the legislature. But Doc Bowen ran on a campaign in 1972 of property tax reform. He wanted to change our whole property tax system. Property taxes were too high. Taxpayers were complaining. Voters were complaining. And he struck a nerve and was elected governor in 72. And in 73, he passed major property tax reform in the state of Indiana. Look at those numbers. We doubled the state sales tax from 2% to 4%. 1973. 1972, the sales tax rate in the state of Indiana for everything was 2%. It's a little different than that today. We doubled it from 2 to 4, and that was when we added the property tax replacement credit. And at that point in time, everyone that has been around for at least 10 years will remember that PTRC was supplemented with sales tax dollars from the state of Indiana to reduce property taxes, and that was a distribution that was given by the state to the locals to reduce the property tax rate, to show a credit on that tax bill so that homeowners would be confident in their Indianapolis legislators, or at least that was the intent. It was the first time that Indiana law permitted the passage of a local option income tax, CAGIT, 1973. Now today, all 92 counties have an income tax of some sort. It set limits on rates and levies for CAGIT counties, so even then, the state of Indiana was controlling the growth of property taxes and controlling local government decisions and the amounts of money that local government could collect by controlling those rates, and it established local tax control boards. But he wasn't done just yet. Towards the end of his second term as governor of Indiana, he passed Bowen 2.0 property tax relief. And that is when we first started the assessed value growth quotient. Look what the growth quotient was in '79. Similar to what you have today, right? At the low end, it was 5%, and at the high end, it was 10%. And if local government wanted more, you could just appeal to the tax board, and more than likely, they'd give it to you. Those were accepted more often than not. And your assessed value growth quotients were, again, between 5 and 10%. It also allowed jurisdictions to bank the difference. If you didn't use the whole growth quotient that you were able to receive, it allowed you to bank it for future use. How many would like to go back to those days? Would you like to see some growth quotients in the 5 to 10% range on a regular basis? Maybe some of you are beginning to see some things get close to that, but certainly the last few years you haven't. And then in 1993 came St. John's versus State of Indiana. Anyone from Lake County? The town of St. John's in Lake County filed suit and eventually went to the Indiana Supreme Court on the constitutionality of our assessed value processes within the state of Indiana, and declared that eventually, after multiple decisions by the Supreme Court and the Indiana Tax Court, declared that Indiana's assessed value processes were unconstitutional. And we had to change things. We had to change it up. For those of you who were in office in those early 2000 years when we were implementing that change, those were really stressful times. Stressful times for county auditors, stressful times for county treasurers. Property tax bills were changing dramatically. Assessed values were changing. We used to assess property based on reproduction cost less depreciation. So if you lived in a really old neighborhood but had a really nice house, you could depreciate nearly all of your assessed value off, and your property taxes would be very low. And then came the changes. And those older neighborhoods saw drastic increases in their property tax bills. And along came 2007. What I refer to as the initial forming of the Tea Party in Indiana. Different than the Tea Party we saw in 2010 in this state. The Tea Party in Indiana in 2007, they were actually throwing tea bags in their property tax bills in the canal in downtown Indianapolis. They closed down Meridian Street on the 4th of July in front of the governor's residence. Meridian Kessler neighborhood, where the governor's residence is. And this is an actual story from WTHR on July 5th of 2007. Taxpayers were complaining that their tax bills doubled, tripled. And the governor said, we got to do something. And called the legislature back into special session. And we passed drastic tax reform once again and implemented the tax caps. Now, the tax caps were not supposed to have any impact on local government, remember? And they haven't had any impact on local government, right? Yeah, right. But the tax caps were intended to not have any impact on local government because, why? Property values will continue to go up every year, 1, 2, 3%. Will rise with your needs and inflation, and we won't have any problems at all. And then what happened in 2009, 8 and 9? The downfall of real estate values, not only in the state of Indiana, but across the country. And for the first time in modern history, Indiana's assessed values were dropping at dramatic rates across the state. And so if you have tax caps at 1, 2, and 3%, and your assessed value is declining, and the cost of government going up, things are beginning to intersect. And those that did not take advantage of all of their AV growth quotients back in the 70s and 80s at 5 to 10% were all in very big trouble. So that is really what kind of led us from where we were through property tax reform in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and 2000s, to where we are today. The one thing consistent, and for those of you who've been around county government and government as long as I have, the one thing that is consistent is the state has always felt that they needed to have some control over your spending, placing limits on what you can grow, what you can spend. And that is the one thing that has been consistent. The way we've calculated the maximum levy has changed, and it's changed dramatically, and it's changing even more the last few years. But the one thing that is consistent is there has always been control on how you spend your dollars. And that's been a problem that a lot of people in local government have had. You want us to provide the services. We're elected to provide the services, but we don't have as much control over how we collect and where we collect those dollars and how much we can raise. Now, the state's given a lot of extra incentives, I'll call them incentives, in income tax options to balance their revenue perspective, but overall, this has been a challenge for local governments over the last few years and continues to be. So let's get to Indiana budgets and where we are in max levy. And max levy really gets back to the basics of your goal of budgeting. And a goal of budgeting is to make sure that your needs and your revenues balance. How many of you can say that that is something your county is able to do on a consistent basis? Balance your needs and your revenues. Good. I think there are some communities that have been impacted by tax caps that have had more challenges with this than others. But overall, that's your goal, and that's the overall goal of putting the budget together. It's the overall goal of putting your household budget together as well, meeting your needs and your revenues. So let's focus first on those revenues. The budget is really more than just a bunch of big numbers. The budget really means something. It's what are the services that you are providing for those big numbers. And that's what we really need to get down to. When we're putting together a budget, what are we able to accomplish with the budget requests that we have in front of the council? What are the goals? What are the objectives? And what are the end results that are desired when you're putting together your budget? The budget creates legal limitations, appropriations, or your spending authorities, your levy. And when someone edited, or when they went to edit this, they said, I think you got a problem there, Tim. You got will crossed out. And I said, no, that's intended. Because with your max levy, the other thing we need to look at is, are you going to be able to collect all of your max levy? Chances are no, because of tax caps. So it's not only how much will you, but can be raised from taxpayers. And then what is the tax rate? And that drives the amount of circuit breaker credits that are received for your taxpayers. So estimating the max levy. There have been some changes over the last few years. There are changes moving forward. How many of you, when you get the calculation from DLGF, what do you do with it? When you get the max levy calculation and estimates from DLGF, is that what you use when you put together your budget? Do you calculate your own? Do you adjust their estimates? What are the goals there? And what are you doing in reality? I haven't put you all to sleep yet, have you? Come on, what are you doing, Hendricks, when you get your max levy calculation, Nancy? So when you're doing your budget, do you have departments turn in budget requests before you receive your max levy from the state of Indiana, from DLGF? And then you put the two together and say, okay, we're so much over or we're so much under. You can go spend more money. That doesn't happen, Nancy? Okay, all right. So in most cases, you've requested the budget requests from each of the departments. They submit those to you. You calculate, bring them all together. You get the number from the state and you go, oh, darn. Yeah, really? Is it just darn? Oh, darn. It doesn't match this year. We're going to have to do some work. So you get the budget estimate, and before July 5th, DLGF shall provide to each of you and each taxing unit an estimate of the unit's max levy permissible by the property tax levies for the ensuing year. So you're going to get that by July 15. You will have that. And this is a side-by-side comparison between what the max levy calculation was in the past and what it is in 17 for 17 pay 18 going forward. And you'll see there are some distinctions between that took place in legislation that passed in 2016. You take your prior year max levy. You then received a one-time, this past year, FIT adjustment. That was a one-time and one-time only adjustment that you received this year. You multiply that by your assessed value growth quotient. You receive the growth quotient from the state. It's another change that took place over the last few years. Now I can't remember exactly which year it was, when they changed the growth quotient from the prior year to the average of the 6 years of your non-farm income. I have not heard. You might hear tomorrow, but it's still a little early, I would think, for that calculation to be coming out of what. Sometimes they don't like to release that until they're ready to give you your levy. And that's going to give you your budget year max levy. And then you will have any other levy adjustments, and we'll talk about some of those levy adjustments that might take place, and that will give you the working maximum levy. There is, in the simplest form, how to calculate your max levy off of what your last year levy was or this year levy was into what it will be for the year future. Pretty simple, really. But a very important number for all of you in putting together your budget estimates for your council. So in 2015, it uncoupled the maximum levy. These are some of the changes that have taken place over the last several years. It uncoupled the max levy calculation from local option income taxes. The CAGIT PTRC is no longer a part of the max levy formula as it was in the past. So it really simplified that formula a lot more. And this change allows the department to compute max levies earlier in the year, as CAGIT PTRC previously were not known until October. So it allows that number for you to have when you're really putting your budget together to give to the council. Because previous to that point in time, oftentimes you had a budget together and you got in the middle of your budget hearings, you received your max levy calculation and you're like, oh, well, I thought we only had to cut this much, but now we really have to cut this much. So it allows a lot of these calculations to take place sooner. And ultimately, it has moved up your whole budget process, and we'll talk about some of those deadlines that, quite frankly, have already passed in the budget process. So in 17, the CUME fund calculation changed. The CUME fund levy adjustment for counties, cities, and towns was modified to consider only the levy for the unit's CUME cap development fund. Previously, that levy adjustment required the comparison between the unit's CCD fund levy and the excess property taxes imposed. You all have excess property taxes, right? There were adjustments in 16 for pay 17 with community health centers as well. For those communities that do have funding for community health centers, that does not apply to all counties, but those that do, there were adjustments that were made. We have here all of the code sites as well, so you can look these up and refer back to them if you do have questions as you're putting things together. We really put this together so that when you receive your max levy calculation, you can go back and refer back and forth and do your own calculation to confirm what those numbers really are and what those numbers should be. And that is something I would hope you all do before you just accept it. Developmental disability centers as well. There were changes that took place in 17 dealing with how that calculation took place for those communities as well that have developmental disability centers. Your one-time FIT adjustment that took place this past year. Financial institutions tax. It's not physical fitness, making sure you run around the block or run around the courthouse. It's financial institutions tax adjustment that took place during 16, pay 7, or yes, beginning 17, pay 18. there was a one-time adjustment in the financial institutions tax. Any questions? Concerns? Frustrations? Problems? Come on, you're too quiet. Now you've all done this, right? On May 1st, every unit was supposed to report to DLGF an estimate of the total amount of the political subdivision's debt service obligations that will be due in the last 6 months of this year, and an estimate for the debt service obligations that will be due in 2019. That was due to the department by May 1st of this year. You were responsible for your submission for the county. All fiscal officers of each unit of government in the county were also responsible for submitting that to DLGF. Remember, the budget process is moving forward. You're all going to have tax rates by December 31st. These deadlines this year are very important. You know, in the past, you might have gotten by not certifying your AV, your CNAVs on time. You might have gotten by not submitting all of these deadlines on time. For DLGF to receive all the information, put it through their miracle magic, and get a tax rate out on the other side and approved budgets and 1782 notices, and everything finished and complete by December 31st, you are not going to have the luxury this year of missing deadlines. And if you don't submit correct information, it can also have dramatic impact on you. Just yesterday, anyone in central Indiana might have seen on the news a story about a local school district in southern Indiana that in filling out their debt service obligation for 2018, they had a lease appropriation debt of $1.1 million. Well, it was a lease appropriation debt, but they also put it in their debt classification, and when they submitted what their debt payments were for 2018 to DLGF, they double submitted what their debt obligation was of $1.1 million. Taxpayers all received property tax increases, and they all looked at their tax bill, and where you differentiate where your tax dollars are going, it all was going to the schools and debt service, and it showed that the schools had over-reported, and no one, the local field rep for budget, DLGF, did not correct it or catch it, and the tax rates were increased more than what was necessary for the school corporation, the small school corporation, Richland Bean Blossom in Monroe County. When you're submitting these numbers, it's important, and don't be thinking that, well, it's someone else's obligation to review and check it, and if it's wrong, they'll catch it. No, it's your responsibility. When you're submitting your numbers, you need to make sure those numbers are, one, submitted on time, and two, submitted correctly, because it can have devastating effect on taxpayers, if not. And even worse than just the impact it can have on the dollars, it's in the court of public opinion, where they look and they say, local government, they don't know what they're doing. The school corporation doesn't know what they're doing. They turned in the wrong numbers again. And it caused for a very unpleasant school board meeting last night, I understand. So as one, if you've not submitted this, make sure when you get back to your county, you do submit. And two, make sure that you are submitting, as you're making your submissions, review the numbers. Make sure they make sense. Understand differences from last year. Don't just roll your CNAVs and say, yep, looks good, it rolled correctly. Well, where is it different from last year? Compare to last year. Get an understanding from the assessor. Did this really go up 5%? Did this one really go up 15% in this taxing district? Does this really make sense? Because it's a lot easier to do it before you certify CNAVs than after you get tax rates, after you get budgets, and then find out, oops, I guess we got a problem. So make sure as you're doing these, one, you're hitting your timelines, two, you're doing so as correctly as possible, and review those numbers. More changes come in the summer. Before July 15th of this year, the department shall provide each political subdivision with an estimate of the property tax rate that you would have that could be imposed in the budget year for each cum fund or fund for which a max levy rate is established. So by July 15th, DLGF will also give you an estimated rate. Should you take the maximum levy, what that rate would be. Again, it's an estimate, and that estimate and an estimate at the same time of the max levy of the tax rate that will be imposed for all property taxes on debt service as well. So they will give you what those max rates could be. That's something that should be used during your budget process. Should be something you will want to share with your council so that they can say, what's the impact of this budget today? If we were to adopt the max levy, what's the estimated impact? And if they're not asking those questions, and trust me, I've sat at council meetings, I know they don't ask those questions. They should be asking those questions. And you should be giving them some of that information so that they can say, oh yeah, I did know that already. So when after they've approved a budget and someone says something and they go, well, I didn't know it would have that impact, you can say, yeah, you did. I provided that information to you. Remember? It's in your packet on July 31st. Oh, that's what that was? I didn't understand it. I didn't ask a question about it, but I didn't understand what it was. That's why you have the information. It helps you share responsibility or spread responsibility back to those that are responsible for actually calculating the budget, or approving the budget, I should say. Before August 1, DLGF will provide each taxing unit an estimate of the amount by which the taxing unit's property tax distribution will be reduced by circuit breaker. So this is what, the third year they've done this by this point in time. First year numbers maybe weren't real accurate. This past year, were they closer? Did anyone go back and compare with what the estimates were after you submitted your abstract, to compare what the estimate was and reality, and to see if they were closer this year? Were they better? Anyone? Within reason, or were there still disparities? And they don't have all data, so they can't be accurate, I mean, to a T yet. You got to remember, by this point in time, had every one of you turned in your CNAVs? So they don't even have certified assessed values yet from you. So they're giving you estimates before they even have your certified net assessed value. So they don't really have anything firm to make that calculation. They're giving you an estimate based on trends that they are seeing from their assessors across the state and where they believe assessed values are going to be. So we can't find fault if they aren't accurate if we've not given them good data yet either. But at the same token, I do believe that they are using new modeling or better modeling to give better estimates moving forward on those circuit breaker impacts. So many times when we're talking about budgeting, so many times when we're talking about assessed values, so many times when we're talking about different aspects of the process, we all look at it in a single silo. Folks, it all interrelates. Everything we do, everything you do has an impact on the budget because it all relates back to what you're able to collect. And it all interrelates from the assessor to combining the data to calculating the impacts of circuit breakers to understanding what will then take place, hopefully, with parcel level detail on your abstract for 2018, pay 2019. As the abstract, hopefully, moves forward to the gateway process going forward. But everything you do interrelates. It all works together. It's all a continuous cycle of gathering data, calculating, reviewing. You do it in the budget process. You do it when you get your actual tax rates. You do it when you calculate your abstract and you see how much revenue are we really able to collect versus what we had appropriated in our budgets, and do we then have to go back and make adjustments to budgets after that point in time? Because unfortunately, there are communities that today you now have to take into account your circuit breaker loss when you're presenting your budget and you're preparing your budget, correct? How many of you submitted the number that DLGF provided to you last year? How many of you submitted a number less than what DLGF provided to you as the impact on circuit breaker? How many put in a 0? I gotta tell you, I know communities that did put 0, even though they had large circuit breaker loss. They put in a 0. And that's where you put your hand or your head in the sand and you just ignore the fact that there's going to be loss in your levy as a result of circuit breaker. You're not going to be able to collect all of the amount that you have in your max levy because of circuit breaker. And if you don't have much circuit breaker loss, congratulations. But more and more communities, it's happening and it's occurring. And in some cases, those losses are pretty dramatic and pretty drastic. And if you're not taking into account that, you're burying your head in the sand and ignoring it. I had a community that said, well, that's my max levy. We approved a budget based on the max levy. It's in the budget. And I said, can you fund the budget? This was a city. And the mayor said, well, it was in the budget, so I can spend the money. And I said, can you spend the money if you don't have it coming in? Yeah, someone knows what community I'm talking about. And he goes, it's in the budget. And I said, that's not the question. But too many times the council doesn't understand the right question to ask, the media doesn't understand the right question to ask, and they've convinced themselves it's in the budget so I can spend it. Well, you can't spend it if you're not going to collect enough money to fund the budget. So make sure throughout that process, you continually review, you continually monitor. Again, you've collected the first installment of taxes. as you're getting ready to do your settlement and after you do your settlement, how does that compare? What percentage did you collect this year versus last year for spring installment? What percentage did you collect based on what you anticipated collecting? Were there major employers that did not pay? Or major taxpayers, I should say, that did not pay? Where's your revenue? And if it's not coming in as strongly as you anticipated, do you need to go back and monitor your budget and adjust your budget? Because while it might be in the budget, remember the little seesaw we had at the beginning? Revenue needs. If spending is higher than what you're bringing in, you're in trouble. And that's why it's always important to go through that process. So Jackie had also talked to us about putting together some information about the whole budget process. You understand the process of the notice, the public hearings, the adoption, the notices that you need to give. Make sure that you're giving the appropriate notices, not only at budget time, but you also have to make sure that when you're making adjustments to your budget, if you're making adjustments to a salary ordinance, or you're adding new positions, you're making the appropriate notices to the taxpayers within your board, your county council agendas. You're recognizing it within the minutes and doing that because that's all a part of the budget process, believe it or not. You think the budget's done in the fall when you complete it? The budget's never finished. There are adjustments to the budget when a new position is added and you have to make the necessary changes, and you need to do the necessary noticing when those take place. So make sure you're following that process. And please, don't bury your head in the sand. Because in all too many cases, circuit breakers are having impact, and we cannot ignore them, even though you are the ones that fill in that blank on your budget form as to what the impact is going to be on circuit breaker. You're the one that's doing it. They're not telling you what number to use or that you have to use, but make sure that what you use is consistent. As I said, since 17, we have to adopt net budgets. But you control what that number is. Defend that number. Be able to defend that number. So I would suggest what you do is you either take the number word for word from DLGF and put it in as this is what my circuit breaker loss is going to be, or you go through a process to make amendment or adjustments to that in what you believe would be reasonable impact from circuit breaker change. Maybe it's data you received from your assessor, changes in budgets and assessed values. If assessed values grew much faster, maybe you're going to see lesser impact from circuit breaker, but be able to defend that, because if next year the council says, but you told me I had this much to spend and that's what we spent, and now you're telling me we aren't going to bring in enough revenue, and you might be able to handle that one year, but not all of you have enough revenue in a rainy day fund or in a general fund balance to cover that year over year. And so as a result, you don't want to have to report and say, yeah, council, I didn't give you a good number, and we're not going to bring in as much revenue, and mid-year we need to cut our budget for this year. It's too late. Well, it's not too late. But you're behind the 8 ball when you do it that way. So make sure that you have a number in there in your net budget, and you can defend what that number is when you're doing so. Now, 19, as you realize, by December 31st of this year, you're going to get a budget your tax rates for next year. Certified budget for 2019 will be certified by December 31st of this year. For those taxing units or those counties that have a taxing unit in them that are issuing debt at the end of the year, they will have until January the 15th to provide that rate. So if you have maybe if you're not issuing debt, but you have a school corporation or a city that's going to issue debt in December, and a lot of units do issue debt in December at year end, then they will have until January the 15th to actually give you their tax rates and certify your budget for next year. Or if they are filing a shortfall in December, they would have until January the 15th. In most cases, it's going to be units that are issuing debt that would delay the rates. So as I say again, and I can't stress enough, and I'm not DLGF, so you can't yell at me like you will hear from them tomorrow and say, but I can't get the information from my assessor. This is what's not fair. The statute says the auditor certifies net assessed values to the DLGF. Doesn't say when the assessor gives you the information. Doesn't put onerous responsibility on them, even though we all know who gives you the CNAVs. The assessor. I would hope that you've, especially for communities that have had challenges in the past few years with turning in your AVs late, will have some of that dialogue, or I have been having that dialogue with your assessors to ensure that you are able to turn the information in a timely manner. Because with this new schedule, as you remember, I think about 60 of you received tax rates on February 14th. Very late February 14th this past year. To move that whole process up 6 weeks to December 31st is going to take a lot of effort from DLGF to be able to complete that, and they're going to need your partnership to get your information to them timely. There were some counties that were not certifying their CNAVs until December this past year. There's no way they'll be able to turn around a budget in a week. So this is a max levy calculation for an actual county for this year. It goes through that whole process. It's probably pretty hard for you to read from here. It may be even hard for you to read on the handout I gave you, and I apologize for that. But again, it goes through the calculation we walked through earlier. As you see, the really important number in all of this is what is your AV growth quotient? What is the average last 6 years of non-farm income in the state of Indiana? We don't see big variations in AV growth quotient like we used to now that we're averaging 6 years, because 1 year falls off and you just add the most recent. So it is very slow change. You had 4% last year. I would not anticipate much difference in what that number is. We're taking off 2013, adding in 2018, so it really will not be that much different in your growth quotient changes. I would anticipate it would be pretty similar to 4% as it was last year, or what your number was last year. But it goes through the one-time adjustment, and then the annual adjustments in cum cap development, mental health, developmental disabilities adjustments, and then your final estimated max levy. So while there is certain impact from some of those other changes, your growth quotient is the big one. This is something you all can do. When you receive this from DLGF, they'll give you the breakdown. It shouldn't be that difficult. Compare it. Make sure the numbers are right. Make sure that they're pulling in the right adjustments. Make sure they're pulling in the right max levy from prior year, which they should, and run through those calculations to ensure that you're giving yourselves as much opportunity as possible. So as Jackie said several years ago, in this room, I think, I received the Outstanding County Treasurer Award. My roots are in Allen County. I'm from here. I had several people ask me earlier about the family. A few of you were around when our oldest son was born 22 years ago. Proud to say that Ian graduated from IU a couple of weeks ago. He is now off my payroll and will be on his own payroll for the Indiana Pacers, hence the blue and gold I'm wearing today. No, he won't be the starting guard or the forward, but he'll be in marketing and ticket sales for the Pacers. And if this week goes well, and that is a big if, our youngest son, Colin, will be a high school senior come Friday. Yeah, we're really hoping for that German final to boost him to be able to become a senior. Hoping he's studying right now, since that's tomorrow morning. So he's in the middle of finals week. He also is playing lacrosse for Cathedral High School in Indianapolis, and hoping that they can win another state championship here in the next 2 weeks in boys lacrosse. Our next speaker is Angie, and as Jackie described or gave you Angie's bio, I'll give you more detail, because I know you always like to connect with who we are as people. Angie's got 2 boys as well. Angie's boys like soccer. Fortunately, her boys are a little younger than mine. But Max and Ryan, Max graduated from preschool last night and will be a full-time kindergartner in the fall and joining his big brother in elementary school. So if you have any questions, please ask them. Angie's going to walk through the 1782 notice, and then we're going to continue to be around to assist you with any questions you might have.